thank you so much for making time out of your day to attend our session called Library Folks Leading by Example, Incorporating Teaching about Indigenous Territory Acknowledgements in Presentations. I'm very pleased to be working with my colleague from the Center for Teaching and Learning Technologies, Kyle Shaughnessy, who will be doing the first part of the session, and then I'll follow up after him. So before we really get started though, I wanted to give you an opportunity just to get familiar with this environment and to let you know that we are recording this session, as a few people wrote to me after we advertised it and said they were going to be on vacation and would we be offering it again. And so for those folks, we are recording the session, and if you're not too interested in being recorded, just make sure your camera is turned off and your microphone is turned off. And if you're not comfortable participating in any of the dialogue in the chat, just don't do that, as the chat is also being recorded. I'd like to formally begin by thanking the people on whose territory I am currently occupying as an unintentional guest and visitor. I arrived here without knowledge of the Musqueam people, and through this position that I've been able to be with the UBC Library, I've learned so much about the Musqueam people. And since I started at UBC, the Silky pole has been raised, and that's what you're seeing in front of you. This is by the UBC bookstore, and it is a wonderful story of the beginnings of Musqueam occupation in this area. It's a great story, and I hope you have a chance to hear it from a Musqueam person sometime. My name is Sarah DuPont, and I'm currently the head of the Huihua Library, and I am a Métis guest on the territory of the Musqueam people. And I was thinking about that. What does it really mean to be a Métis guest? And I wanted to share something with you, as we're all, you know, kind of missing out on that sense of community right now. At least I am. I'm missing being part of the Métis community. Usually by now we would have had the Festival du Bois in Maillardville near Port Coquitlam. And I just wanted to share a video of what takes place at the festival. And so if you'll bear with me, I'd love to share my screen with you and show you a video. Can everybody see the video screen? Oh, and I can't see any of you now. Oh dear, everything's gone awry. Let's see. So, oh, you had no audio. Oh, you missed it. Okay, I'm sorry. Well, that was a video of the Festival du Bois, and I'll share it with you perhaps later on. I couldn't see the instructions from our wonderful moderator, Carissa. Thank you, Carissa, for letting me know that you had no audio. We'll move on to a little bit more of my introduction. I'm from a place called Prince George, which is in northern British Columbia. If you look at the map on the right-hand side, it is a map of all the Indigenous language groups in British Columbia. And if you look in the middle, there's a gray dot, that's Prince George. So I am from the territory of the Clélitene. And the diagram on the left-hand side is an explanation of the name of the people. So it says the word Clédli means where the two rivers flow together, and Tene means the people. And so my childhood was spent in this territory. The picture of myself on the right-hand side of the screen is the Nechako River, and that's one of the two rivers. And then the river on the left-hand side is the Fraser River, and that's the territory of the Clédli Tene. The context for this session is remembering back to those of us who were working for the UBC Library in 2017, and we visited the reserve area of the Musqueam people. We went down by busload, and we had 6 different groups, and we learned and listened to speakers who were gracious enough to share about the territory where UBC is and some of the important activities that take place in the community as well as on the land. So taking us back, this is on the banks of the Fraser River, which is really wonderful. It's a connection, a grounding point to me back to my home community. The Fraser is a very long river, and so it is wonderful to still be connected to it. And we also learned a little bit about the stream that goes through the community, and it was a wonderful opportunity to learn about how Musqueam is reclaiming some of its traditional practices around water management. So taking us back there, the context for this session is to expand upon where we were and to learn more about how to acknowledge territory in a way that's meaningful to you and to the people who are listening to you. Even though I tried to share what it means to me as a Métis person to be still able to practice our cultural activities as a guest on the territory of others, you may find ways to bring meaning and personal connection to this work as you are doing the work of UBC Library. So I'd like to pass it over to my colleague Kyle, and he's going to guide us through a conversation just about this. So over to you, Kyle.
Great. Thanks so much, Sarah. Matsi Adanate. My name is Kyle Shaughnessy, and I hold a joint position as an education consultant between CTLT Indigenous Initiatives and the Workplace Learning and Engagement Team of HR. And today I am speaking to you from where I live, which is on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Tsleil-Waututh and Stalo peoples. And I endeavor to carry myself in a good and humble way while I'm here and express my gratitude for their tolerance of my presence on these lands. My background, Irish and Dene, so my ancestors on one side are European settlers, and on the other side, of my family were Clico, First Nations from Yellowknife NWT. And so this is where I was born and continue to align myself culturally. I've also lived in a number of Arctic settlements in communities as well throughout my growing up years. So I've spent a lot of time out in Inuit communities as well. And I'm also Two-Spirit, which is an integral part of my identity as an Indigenous person. But due to the loss of cultural practices of many Indigenous nations as part of the colonization process, there's not really a large amount of knowledge on traditional roles and stories of Dene Two-Spirit people. So this is an ongoing relearning and reinventing process for myself and for many other Two-Spirit people from other nations as well. So the next slide. Okay. All right. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about territory acknowledgements. And one of the reasons that this is a topic that really calls to me is that I noticed, as well as many other people, just over the last few years, but particularly probably about 5 or 6 years ago, it often felt like territory acknowledgements were just sort of an agenda item that were checked off at the beginning of meetings, and they weren't necessarily done with intention, with heart, with a good understanding of what it is that we're trying to achieve and acknowledge. And they were often just like, okay, we're on this territory, here's the washrooms, grab them up, let's get going. And so it's become increasingly important to me, as well as a lot of other folks, to find ways to ensure that when we're doing a territory acknowledgement, that we're actually connecting to the words that we're speaking and have some knowledge and intention behind it. Something you may have actually noticed in my territory acknowledgement was that I expressed my gratitude for the Tsleil-Waututh and Stalo people's tolerance of my ongoing presence. And it's very important to me to state my gratitude in that way, as opposed to thank you for having me here. So a colleague of mine a few years back, Jessica St. Jean, who is Squamish, had shared with me just sort of this metaphor of often when people give territory acknowledgements and they say, you know, I'm grateful to be here, so thank you so much for having me here. It comes across as thanking for something that was not offered. So it's a bit like showing up to somebody's house with all of your bags on their front porch, going in, grabbing a snack out of the fridge, sitting down on the couch without really acknowledging, without any sort of invitation, and saying, thanks for having me here, when someone had not asked you in the first place. So I think that it's very important to acknowledge tolerance of our presence as opposed to an invitation, because not all of us were invited. A majority of us were not. However, some of us are, which brings me sort of to the next topic, which is around diversity of voices. So in terms of diversity of voices, it's another thing that tends to come up in territory acknowledgements is acknowledging our presence here as settlers. But when we do that, we're also centering the role of folks as settlers, because there's a diversity of people in the room. Some people have settled for various reasons. Some people may be here out of refugee status. And also not everyone in the room is from outside of this territory. There are going to be Musqueam, Stalo, Tsleil-Waututh, folks in the room who are not necessarily acknowledging their presence as visitors because these are their territorial lands. These are their traditional lands. And so we need to understand there's also a diversity of voices and folks in the room. And then one last sort of critical thought that I'll share is that with this move to doing online education, online meetings, and then therefore online territory acknowledgements, we need to acknowledge that online territories can also be exclusive territories, because not everyone's going to have equal access to online points of connection for work, for just general connection to family members and friends, for social well-being. And there's plenty of Indigenous communities that I've visited and worked in that have only recently got electricity, let alone having internet access, access to technology to be able to be part of these online spaces. So I think that's also important to acknowledge when we're acknowledging territories, that online territories can actually be quite exclusive. So land acknowledgements at UBC. So as you might have noticed, offering land acknowledgements at the beginning of presentations and events, as well as some class and meetings, is a regular occurrence at UBC. And there's a great resource on UBC's online Indigenous portal, which is called Guidelines for Acknowledging Musqueam People at Ceremonies and Events. And here you can find more info about where and when land acknowledgements are done and who the most appropriate person is to do them. And we can provide a link for you in the chat for that. So UBC Point Grey is located on the traditional ceremonial unceded territory of the Musqueam people. So let's talk for a minute about what this means. This means that over 100 years ago, UBC was built upon Musqueam land without prior consent or compensation to the Musqueam people. And at this time, close transactions like these were sadly very commonplace. But as we become more and more aware over time, this is no longer something that we can ignore or continue to accept. So part of taking steps towards mending some of that damage done is acknowledging that we are situated on Musqueam territory, or an Okanagan territory if we're at UBC Okanagan. And while this may seem like a really small but simple gesture, it's also something that's part of, it's connected to a much larger purpose and context of recognizing Indigenous history and also stewardship of the land. And so when we open our events and activities in this way, we're also doing so as a way of showing our intentions to carry ourselves during that event in a way that's mindful of this mending process. So whether that be leadership and guidance from Musqueam or Okanagan people on the event being held, integrating Musqueam representation through resources, class materials, or personal involvement, or on consistently connecting back our event activities, our class work, to the greater purpose of mending this relationship. And also as an educational institution, our obligation to make things right with Indigenous peoples is extremely important, given the enormous and ongoing impacts of generational trauma, which was caused by the residential school system. And also in April of 2018, Santa Ono delivered a statement of apology on behalf of the university, which is also something that you can see the full text for on the UBC Indigenous portal as well. And the apology was delivered at the opening ceremony of the Residential School History and Dialogue Center at UBC Point Grey. So Musqueam has agreed to do work in partnership with UBC on many initiatives towards reconciliation that span a variety of university programs and facilities and academic departments. And again, that's something you can find out more on the UBC Online Indigenous portal. And so part of the work that we're doing at UBC CTLT Indigenous Initiatives is expanding some of the existing resources available, and then also connecting with staff and faculty across the university to build greater confidence, competency, and awareness around doing land acknowledgements. And this can be a difficult thing for many of us who've never done one before, and especially if we have a lack of understanding around how to do one and why it's being done. So right now, I'm going to sort of take us through focusing on 3 considerations for acknowledging territory in a sincere and meaningful way. So let me just flip the slide. So just to go over, some of the common questions that we do actually get quite a few inquiries around land acknowledgements about how to deliver them in a meaningful way. And these are some of the common questions that we get. And again, a lot that are addressed in that guidelines around addressing Musqueam territory document. So the first consideration for offering meaningful land acknowledgements, I would say, is educate yourself. So priority areas to educate yourself would be UBC's history on Musqueam territory and the history of Musqueam people in general, and that's if you're at Point Grey. Otherwise, history of the Okanagan people and history of Okanagan people with UBC as well. And also educating yourself on UBC's commitment to reconciliation with Musqueam and Okanagan people as well. And so what are those processes taking place? What is some of the work already being done, and what are some of the plans that we're looking ahead to? And then also I would recommend educating yourself on the legacy of residential schools in Canada and the way that intergenerational trauma has continued to play out in our communities. And so having an increased understanding and sense of connection with the experiences of Indigenous people and the impacts of colonization is something that might help you feel a natural and sincere investment in those healing relationships. And it's going to help you better understand the importance of doing a land acknowledgement as a small but important step along that path to reconciliation. So the next thing I would encourage you to consider is going beyond acknowledgement. So embedding Indigenous representation and involvement throughout your course, your event, or your meeting is a major component to ensuring that your acknowledgement extends into action. So examples of this would be seeking consult of Musqueam and Okanagan people on university initiatives, including Indigenous perspectives in training materials and programming. Intentionally seeking out ways to connect your gathering or your event back to the territory that you're on bolsters the meaning of the acknowledgement that you give, as it shows your sincere commitment to actually creating that place-based change. And so the third thing that I would encourage you to consider in terms of delivering a meaningful territory acknowledgement is relationality. So Indigenous ways of being and knowing are rooted in relationality, and this can be reflected in your land acknowledgement by stating your relationship to the land that you're currently on and that UBC is currently on, that you have previous and ongoing connections to, such as where you were born and raised, where you've lived, where you've worked, places of meaning for you. And so stating your relationship back to ancestral lands involves acknowledging your own ancestry. So where have your ancestors come from? So for example, do you belong to another Indigenous nation globally or on Turtle Island? And if not, what is the story to how your ancestors and how your family came to be here? So taking some of these 3 considerations into consideration, I'm going to encourage folks to take a couple of minutes each to introduce themselves to other group members, and I would like them to focus on 2 aspects, and we're going to be splitting you up into small groups of 2 and 3 people in just a minute. But there's 2 things I would like you to focus on. Is what is your experience with offering land acknowledgements? So is this something that you've done quite a lot? Is it something that kind of freaks you out so you avoid it? Is it something you actually just haven't had the opportunity to do? And I want to really invite all experiences into the room because that is quite a common thing for folks to feel sort of anxious and maybe pass them off because they're worried about maybe not doing them right. So please, I invite people to be transparent and as comfortable as possible and just honestly share what their experience is. And then also what that experience has been like. So is it something that has felt awkward or anxiety provoking? Is that possibly because folks are getting worried about getting it wrong? And then there might be other people that are feeling comfortable and enthusiastic, either because they've practiced it or because they have a really solid understanding of what that relationship is. And this is a way for them to be able to acknowledge it in a really formalized way. So yeah, so we're going to be getting people together in groups of 2 or maybe 3. And so first thing is, what is your experience with offering land acknowledgements? And second, what has that experience been like? We're going to chat on that for about, I'd say 5 minutes, and then come back to the larger group just to have a general share back about what those conversations were like. So I think Chris is us into small groups.
We have Carissa, who's helping us out with some of the technical issues, and Amy Perot, who just had to leave actually, but she was helping us with some links in the chat. So very appreciative to everybody from CTLT for putting this session together. So shifting forward a little bit into taking this into the library context around reference, teaching, and learning, we thought that it might be a good idea to think about working with people at the reference desk and guiding them through some of these questions as well around history and situationality, and where you might find some resources to do the research for traditional territories. So if we're to start off with some of the local contexts, one of the resources that you can look to is the Musqueam and UBC Libraries LibGuide that the Huihui Library staff have put together. Also a shout out to Kayla. Yay, welcome Kayla to Huihui. And shout out to Tanis. Thanks for joining the session to be my backup from Huihui. This is a research guide that we've put together to bring together some of the resources about Musqueam that exist here at UBC and online. So if you have a desire to learn about Musqueam history and culture, you can check this place out. It's kind of your one-stop shop for yourselves, but also for students and faculty who are coming to you with questions. We've gathered together not just land-based resources, but we've also pulled together some of the discourse around the Sesnam, the city. That was an exhibit done around the Musqueam's work to protect and preserve the Marpole Midden. You may remember some years ago near the Arthur Lang Bridge, there were Musqueam members protecting their lands from development and protecting their ancestors. So we've gathered some resources about that and put it together. You might also have people wanting to include research about Musqueam into their works. And so we've pulled together some theses that have been done about Musqueam and by Musqueam scholars in order to assist you with that. So you may have that image of the map burned into your mind from that last slide. I wanted to give you a little bit more about how to research about the land, about the place specific. The map that you just saw is from the Musqueam Declaration, and you'll see that that shape is pretty much consistent with the shape that is on the map from their Statement of Intent map that's available on the left-hand side. So for those of you not too familiar with the treaty process in British Columbia, there is a modern treaty process that was started in the early 1990s. And for nations to participate in that process, the first thing that they had to do was fill out a statement of their intent to claim. And so they filled out the form, which you can see on the right-hand side, and that provides some interesting contextual information from that point in history when it was filled out. And it also provides the map. And so if you start to think about where you are and you start to look at multiple maps, you might discover that the territories claimed by many nations actually overlap each other. So another resource that helps us to kind of sort out that information of those overlays is the website that's already been mentioned in the chat. Thanks, Kayla, is nativeland.ca. And another one of our Huihua librarians, Carlene, she actually worked for the nativeland.ca folks when she was a student librarian. This is a great website for just about anywhere in the world where you can put in your location. It's a little bit hard to see, but I've typed in Musqueam First Nation in the search box there. You can search territories, languages, and treaties, and it can help you start to unravel some of the complexities of whose territory you're on and who claims it. It can get a little bit tricky though, because as I said, many people have done traditional land use activities in many different places. So when I put in Musqueam and I put my mouse over that little green spot there, it says that we're on the land of the Tsleil-Waututh, the Stalo, the Staminas, the Musqueam, and another one for the Tsleil-Waututh. So you really do need to understand some of that historic and current political context as well. So nativeland.ca is a wonderful starting point, especially if you're a presentation somewhere in the world that you're not really too familiar with that history. So it's good to do your homework if you can, but Native Land is the first to say that this is a work in progress. And the best source, of course, is to contact the nations in question. So another example that we can consider for looking for other resources on how to talk about traditional territories, if you look at this photo of the Huihua Library, which, by the way, means echo in the Squamicham language, if you wanted to know a little bit more about the traditional territory of the Squamish Nation, if you head to their website, they do something a little bit different about how they talk about their lands. You can find this information on their About Us and Our Land section, and they talk about the number of hectares. They describe it as the number of villages, and they talk about it in the four directions of the north, the south, the east, and the west. And so that's how this territory was talked about. And then they translate it into the present day cities of Vancouver, Burnaby, and New Westminster, and many more. So it's a big territory. And they say, in addition, we used and occupied the various lands located in Howe Sound. And that terminology, use and occupancy, is a very important phrase in the treaty process, as well as traditional territory studies. So the traditional land use studies often use that terminology. So for those of our audience in the Okanagan, of course, in your territory, your member communities are part of the Okanagan Nation Alliance. So the complexities of the nation territories up there, not only is it in British Columbia and constituted by all these different communities, but it also crosses into the United States. So it's a huge chunk of territory, and you may have neighbors across the medicine line or the United States-Canada border who are also talking about territory in the similar ways of the folks in the Okanagan. So maps and mapping and territories, it can be quite complex to research. And what we've tried to do is pull together some of the resources that can help you and your students and your faculty talk about place. You can talk about place through language areas, such as this featured map here. First Peoples Cultural Council has put together this language map of BC. And if you have a chance to visit that map and look at it more closely, you'll see that the boundaries are very much blurred, and that they're fuzzy, you know. So it's not exactly like when you step over this particular line, people stop speaking that language, because we know people don't stay in one place. Languages are typically spoken all over the place. We have Métis people, we have Cree people in Vancouver, and these language groups are very, very diverse. And so the fuzziness of the line is intentional. We also have maps that talk about place in terms of treaties, which you'll see a little bit further on, population. And we've also had quite a few folks interested in residential schools maps. So to see where, if you're from a particular area in Canada, what was the closest residential school to you when you were growing up? Did you know if there was a residential school near you? And if not, maybe explore that and see how that history was part of your lived experience or not. So moving on to talk a little bit more about treaties as well. You heard Kyle talk about the unceded territory of the Musqueam people, and a lot of people have questions about what does unceded mean, and it's spelt U-N-C-E-D-E-D. So of that is cede, C-E-D-E. And when we think about territories where there are treaties, that is one way of ceding or surrendering certain claims to land. And so historic treaties are shown in the map on the screen. And one point I will make is to ask you to look at British Columbia. And you'll see that Treaty 6, which is Kayla's territory, also extends into about a third of British Columbia. I've often heard from graduates of UBC that there are no treaties in British Columbia, and I want to emphasize to you, my colleagues, librarians, that yes, there are treaties in British Columbia. There is the historic Treaty of Number 6. There are the Douglas treaties on Vancouver Island. The Nisga'a Treaty was a little bit more modern, and then we have individual treaties being negotiated and completed to this day, including the Tsawwassen Final Agreement. So understanding if there have been treaties attempted or completed in the places where you are or places where you live is really an important first step in talking about the territory, because you don't want to assume that every nation is on unceded territory. Recently, I learned that the Cledley people of Prince George, they ceded their territory, but the historical record has not treated that story with all truth. And so recently, they did a permanent exhibition at the exploration place in Prince George, and I had a chance to go and visit it. And I learned more about the forced removal of these people. They were forced to sell their land to the Hudson's Bay Company, I believe it was, for cents on the dollar of what it would sell to settler Canadians. And then they burned the village down when people were reluctant to leave. They didn't want to leave. So the village was burned down. All that remains today is a cemetery. And then the Hudson's Bay Company, or the company that bought it, sold it and made a ridiculous profit off of it. So it's a really sad story. The ceding might not necessarily be what we would call fair today, and there may be what we call specific claims to make reparations to the fact that they were not paid adequately. And so you may have a lot of people coming to your desk looking for specific claims research. And the Union of BC Indian Chiefs, they specialize in that specific claims research. They're located downtown, and they have some really expert researchers there, and a library and archives collection as well. They're very good friends of ours. So in thinking about your teaching, if you're a teaching librarian, one of the things that you can do is to talk about territory by using examples from different First Nations in British Columbia. And if you want to, for example, teach about primary sources, we know that nations are reclaiming their names. So the names in the historic record look very different than what they may look like now. So Huihua Library, in partnership with Technical Services, has done quite a bit of research into this, and we've created a Names for BC First Nations thesaurus-like document. It's just a PDF for now, and it's meant to expand and change as times change. But you'll see that the term Coast Salish, this is a term that we still sort of use today, but it refers to a lot of different nations within that group. So what you could do is have students looking for primary sources about one of the Coast Salish nations using the preferred name, which is the narrower term on the right-hand side, and see how many results they come up with and the accuracy of those results, or if they can find results at all. And then you might have them try, okay, look for Coast Salish and compare the number of results that they come up with, but also look at the accuracy and see if they can discern whether or not, say, a photograph is of a Tliamin person or a Comox person. So it's a pretty good exercise when it comes to looking at narrower and broader terms. Same with Dunaza. So that's my husband's community, actually. He's Dunaza. He's adopted by the Dunaza Nation, and they call themselves Beaver Indians. But we would look for them under the name Dunaza or Danaza. But their neighbors next to them are actually Soto people who migrated in more recent times. They migrated from Eastern Canada, and they were given permission to settle in the Dunaza area. So they're very close neighbors. They speak a different language, completely different languages. And so when you're looking for, say, if you're doing language studies, you'll want to make sure that the related term, Soto, is understood to be different linguistically from Dunaza. So again, if you're looking at narrower terms and broader terms, I thought we would use interior Salish maybe as an example for an architecture class, because Huihua is an interior Salish pit house. And so we've been doing a lot of looking into what that would mean about our architecture, which groups of people may have built this. So I've highlighted the word Shkwatmuk because my friend Georgina is Shkwatmuk. And so I thought, okay, well, wouldn't it be nice to know if Georgina talked at all about pit houses in her graduate dissertation? So the next thing I would do is look for her name of the nation. I couldn't remember Georgina's last name, for example, if I'm telling a story to students in the architecture class, but I knew her dissertation talked about it somewhere. So I would put Shkwatmuk in the search bar and come up with her thesis, Drumming My Way Home, an intergenerational narrative inquiry about Shkwatmuk identities. So that's just one way you can think about including some of these stories of people that you know into your teaching and learning exercises with classrooms. And you can have them do that as well. You can ask them to think about people they know or places they know and try and figure out which search terms would be most appropriate in our collections. If you don't know any Indigenous people, you can still find Indigenous scholars and authors in the discipline that you are giving a session to. We are very diverse here at UBC. There are people in applied sciences to the Faculty of Medicine in the library. So find the name of a scholar here at UBC and exemplify their work. Demonstrate to students that Indigenous scholarship is really, really successful and prominent here at UBC, and ask them to figure out who the scholars are in their area. You can also find Indigenous scholars from all disciplines, from outside of UBC and from UBC, by having a look to see if we've written a LibGuide that might address the area where you're giving a presentation. So for example, if you were speaking to a GIS class, you might bring up the Maps and Mapping LibGuide. Or if you were talking to a film studies class, we've got a fantastic guide on Indigenous new media. I also want to give a shout out to the e-resources that we have on that guide. In particular, the streaming media that we've bought here at Huiwa Library. We've got a great list of titles for people to include in their classrooms right now. So if you're doing any faculty liaison, please, please, please show them the Google Doc that has all of the streaming media films on it. We're also very diverse amongst each other. So if you're looking for Indigenous perspectives to highlight in your search examples, you can find Indigenous authors at Huiwa. There are Métis people who may be in any given discipline. There are Two-Spirit and Indigenous queer studies scholars at UBC and beyond. And so try to think a little bit outside the box when it comes to examples that you could potentially use in your classrooms. There's also online and gray literature, so don't forget about that as well. And finally, thinking about the land and the territory that you live on and how that is connected, of course, to people. People are scholarly sources, especially our knowledge holders, our knowledge keepers, who may be our elders with a capital E, or they may not be given that designation, but they may be important knowledge holders of special topics such as medicines or a particular story, and they may have a particular role in the community for a certain piece of knowledge. And so that's why we consider Indigenous knowledge keepers as scholarly sources. So in thinking about people and primary sources, we already teach about this. We teach about how to find people in newspapers, interviews, films, photographs, letters, and archives. So for Indigenous scholars, it's really no different. We already know how to teach those skills. So I'm thinking that it's probably not too hard to expand that to Indigenous people if you give it a moment of thought. And if you're curious about how to cite people as sources, in particular knowledge holders, every LibGuide that we've written here at Huiwa has a citations section that includes information on how to cite elders and other knowledge holders in a really respectful way. And if you're really, really interested in this particular skill, I just want to put a plug in for a session that's happened yesterday, today is the 22nd. Oh my goodness, it's happened already. So there will be a recording of that session. It's going to be shared out because I'm going to put it in the weekly update because I told you about it here, and I know that Manisha is recording her sessions, so I'm going to share it with you all after this session. So with that, I just want to thank you all for your time and open it up to questions for both Kyle and I. All right. Well, thank you so much, everybody, for your attention and questions and participation in the group chats. And this session has been recorded, so it will be available to your colleagues if they ask you about it. Just give an honest answer about your participation. And thanks so much for the comments in the chat. Really appreciate that positive feedback. So have a great day, and we'll see you again sometime, hopefully soon.
Bye.